within the family as such. There's the spare and the heir, my brother being the heir and me being the spare. And so I think it was just a really good opportunity to choose a title that had been somewhat used against me for a long part of my life and own that title.
King Charles just uncovered a shocking secret his mother kept hidden for years. Buried deep in Queen Elizabeth's will is a clause about Prince Harry that no one saw coming. When Charles read what she left behind, he couldn't believe his eyes. This changes everything we thought we knew about the royal family. What the Queen did in her final months will leave you speechless.
I know from my own experience that a cancer diagnosis can feel overwhelming. Yet, I also know that early detection is the key that can transform treatment journeys, giving invaluable time to medical teams and to their patients the precious gift of hope.
The truth about Harry's inheritance has finally been exposed, and the consequences are absolutely devastating. The morning of November the 23rd, 2025, started like most others within the historic walls of Buckingham Palace. King Charles III sat at the polished mahogany desk that had once belonged to his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The desk itself carried decades of history, positioned in a private office where some of the monarchy's most sensitive decisions had been made over the years. That particular morning, however, would prove to be anything but routine. Charles had requested what his staff believed would be a straightforward administrative meeting. More than 3 years had passed since his mother's death in September 2022, and certain aspects of her estate required periodic legal review. It was the kind of tedious but necessary work that comes with managing a royal inheritance of such magnitude. His senior legal counsel arrived alongside the keeper of the privy purse and 2 other trusted advisors, all carrying the documents they assumed would be quickly reviewed and filed away. The king, dressed in his typical dark suit with reading glasses resting on his nose, settled into what he expected would be a mundane briefing about assets, properties, and various heirlooms. The leather portfolio containing the estate documents made a soft rustling sound as it was opened on the ancient desk. Page after page detailed distributions that Charles had already seen and approved. Balmoral Castle, Sandringham Estate, pieces from the private jewellery collection all had been allocated and transferred exactly as planned. Everything appeared to be in order, following the protocols that had been established long before his mother's passing. But then something unexpected emerged from the files. Tucked among the familiar documents was a sealed envelope that none of the advisors had noticed during previous reviews. The legal team exchanged uncertain glances. According to their records, all of the Queen's will provisions had already been executed. This sealed document carried markings indicating it was part of the official estate papers, yet it had somehow remained hidden until this comprehensive review. Charles's hands, weathered from 70+ years of life but still steady, broke the wax seal on the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, and he recognized his mother's distinctive penmanship immediately. However, this wasn't the flowing, confident script of her earlier years. The handwriting showed the slight shakiness that had developed in her final months, though every word remained deliberate and clear. The date written at the top of the page read March 15th, 2022, just 6 months before her death. The room fell completely silent as Charles began to read. His advisors watched closely, noticing how their king's expression shifted from simple curiosity to genuine surprise, and then to something far more complex. A range of emotions played across his face, features that had been trained over decades to remain composed in public settings. But this wasn't a public moment. This was a son reading his mother's final thoughts about his other son, the one who had left the royal family, the one whose absence had created a wound that refused to heal. The document Charles held contained a clause that was both meticulously detailed and legally binding. It addressed Prince Harry's inheritance in ways that contradicted everything Charles thought he understood about his mother's final wishes. Or perhaps, more accurately, it revealed wishes she had deliberately kept concealed until precisely this moment. Even in death, Queen Elizabeth was apparently still thinking several moves ahead, still attempting to protect her family in ways they might not fully comprehend until the proper time arrived. Charles read through the passage 3 times, trying to absorb every implication. His legal counsel stepped forward to confirm what he already suspected. The document was absolutely authentic, properly witnessed according to legal standards, and completely enforceable. there could be no question about its validity. The only questions that remained were what should be done with this information and how to move forward. The clause didn't simply leave money or property to Harry. It contained specific conditions and stipulations, creating a framework that would require careful decisions, difficult conversations, and potentially a complete reassessment of the current relationship between the king and his younger son. This wasn't a straightforward bequest that could be quietly processed through the usual channels. This was something that would demand direct engagement with a situation the family had been avoiding for years. One of the advisors cleared his throat gently, breaking through the heavy silence that had settled over the room. They needed guidance on how His Majesty wished to proceed. Should the king be given time to consider this privately before any actions were taken? Should they begin preparing briefing documents for the relevant parties who would need to be informed? The questions hung in the air unanswered, but Charles remained focused on the words his mother had written during her final months on Earth, when she must have known her time was growing short. Charles finally set the document down on the desk and removed his reading glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture that conveyed profound weariness. He found himself imagining his mother at Windsor Castle, sitting in her private study, composing these words in secret. She had told no one about this provision, had sealed it away with specific instructions that it should remain hidden until the appropriate moment. Had she pictured this exact scene? Her eldest son, now king, discovering her hidden wishes and being forced to decide whether to honor them. Of course she had. Elizabeth had always thought everything through with remarkable thoroughness. The weight of the crown suddenly felt heavier than usual on Charles's shoulders. He had inherited his mother's throne, along with all the responsibilities and burdens that came with it. But he had not anticipated inheriting what amounted to an unsolved family crisis, wrapped up in legal provisions that seemed designed to force his hand toward a particular course of action. Yet that was precisely what sat before him now. Not just information, but a choice, or perhaps more accurately, a test of what kind of king and father he intended to be. Would he honor his mother's clearly stated wishes, even if doing so complicated his own plans and preferences for how to handle the situation with Harry? Or would he find a way, as monarchs sometimes must, to interpret duty in a manner that served the present rather than the past? His advisors waited patiently for some indication of his thoughts. The antique clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady ticking. Outside the palace walls, London carried on with its daily rhythm, millions of people completely unaware that inside these historic rooms, a discovery had just been made that could potentially alter the entire course of the House of Windsor. King Charles understood with absolute clarity that whatever he decided at this moment, there would be no going back. His mother's hidden clause was no longer hidden, and now everyone involved would have to face the consequences of what she had set in motion from beyond the grave. The document Queen Elizabeth had left behind specified an inheritance for Prince Harry that was both substantial in its financial value and complex in its requirements. The provision revealed a level of careful thought about her grandson's future that nobody in the family had fully anticipated. According to the terms laid out in her own handwriting, approximately £20 million from her private estate had been set aside specifically for Harry. However, this wasn't a simple gift that he could claim without conditions. The money came wrapped in requirements that demonstrated just how thoroughly the late Queen had considered both Harry's situation and the future of the monarchy itself. The first condition was stated in explicit terms that left no room for misinterpretation. Harry would only receive full access to his inheritance upon agreeing to maintain certain meaningful connections to the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth nations. The Queen's language in the document was remarkably precise for something written by hand. She required that Harry spend no fewer than 90 days per year on British soil or within Commonwealth countries, engaged in work that actively supported either charitable causes or initiatives that would benefit communities across the realm. This wasn't a demand that he return to performing official royal duties. Elizabeth had been far too pragmatic to expect that outcome, but it was definitely a requirement that he remain genuinely connected to the world she had spent 7 decades of her life serving. The second major provision addressed Harry's children, Archie and Lilibet, directly. A portion of the total inheritance, approximately £5 million, had been designated specifically for their education and upbringing. However, even this aspect came with stipulations attached. The funds were to be managed by trustees who would need approval from both Harry and the reigning monarch, which meant that Charles would have some level of oversight over how the money was used. Even more significantly, the Queen had specified that the children should spend meaningful time in the United Kingdom as they grew older. The stated purpose was to maintain their connection to their heritage and their family. She had written that her great-grandchildren should not become strangers to the land of their ancestors, a phrase that carried considerable emotional weight. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire provision was a personal letter that had been attached to the legal document. Written entirely in the Queen's own hand, it was addressed directly to Charles and intended to be read when the clause was eventually discovered. In this letter, she acknowledged the difficulty of the entire situation with Harry. She wrote that she understood the anger many family members felt, the sense of hurt and betrayal that had developed over the past several years. The Queen wasn't minimizing those feelings or pretending they didn't exist, but she also wrote something that cut straight to the heart of her perspective as both a mother and a grandmother. She stated clearly that Harry was still her grandson, that his children were still her great-grandchildren, and that she simply could not leave this world without making one final attempt to ensure they would not be lost to the family completely. The letter revealed a woman who had spent her final months wrestling with the knowledge that her family was fractured and that she was running out of time to do anything about it. The letter to Charles contained what she phrased not as a royal command, but as the genuine hope of a dying mother. She asked him to consider that bridges once burned can sometimes be rebuilt, but only if both sides prove willing to supply the necessary materials. Her inheritance clause, she explained in the letter, was her attempt to supply those materials. What Charles and Harry ultimately chose to build with them would be entirely up to them, but she wanted to ensure they at least had the resources, both financial and emotional, to make the attempt if they were willing. The legal team had spent time thoroughly reviewing the clause and confirmed that it was absolutely ironclad from a legal standpoint. The Queen had consulted with her most trusted legal advisors during the drafting process. Every single word had been carefully chosen to withstand any potential legal scrutiny and to make her intentions crystal clear beyond any possible misinterpretation. This was not a vague suggestion that could be easily dismissed or creatively reinterpreted to suit someone's preferences. This was the formal will of a queen, and more than that, it was the will of a mother and grandmother who had run out of time to fix things herself but refused to give up trying, even after death. The amount of money involved was significant by any normal standard, but not overwhelming when considered against royal family wealth. Elizabeth had been shrewd enough to understand that too large a sum might create its own set of problems. An excessive amount might make it appear as though Harry was being bought, or it might fuel media narratives about special treatment and favoritism. £20 million was enough to provide genuine financial security and create real opportunities, but not so much that it would overshadow the deeper purpose of the entire provision. Because this wasn't really about money at all. It was about connection, about family, about not allowing the bonds to break completely and irreparably. Reading through the document carefully, Charles could almost hear his mother's voice in the phrasing. The language was distinctively hers, somehow managing to be both practical and emotional at the same time, firm in its requirements, yet hopeful about outcomes. She had known she was dying when she wrote this. She had known that the situation with Harry would inevitably become Charles's problem to solve once she was gone. And so she had left him this unusual provision, something that was simultaneously a tool he could use and a burden he would have to carry. Perhaps it was both things at once. The hidden clause in the will was really a hidden plea, a final attempt from a matriarch to keep her family intact, even as she prepared to leave them behind. The document revealed the depth of Elizabeth's concern about the rift with Harry and her determination to do something about it, even if she wouldn't be alive to see the results. She had spent her entire reign thinking about legacy, about what she would leave behind, and this clause suggested that family unity was every bit as important to that legacy as any constitutional achievement or institutional reform. The provision also revealed something about how the Queen viewed her own role in the family crisis. By creating this framework that would require Charles and Harry to communicate and negotiate, she was essentially admitting that direct intervention during her lifetime had failed. She had tried talking to both of them, separately. She had tried maintaining neutral ground. She had tried letting time heal the wounds naturally. None of it had worked well enough to bridge the gap that had grown between father and son, between Harry and the institution, between the life Harry had chosen and the family he had left behind. So in her final months, facing her own mortality with the clear-eyed realism she had always been known for, Queen Elizabeth had decided to try something different. She would use the one tool that would survive her death and carry weight long after she was gone. Her will would speak for her when she could no longer speak for herself, and it would create circumstances that might, just possibly, lead to the reconciliation she desperately wanted to see, but knew she might never witness. Sitting alone in his private office with the documents still resting in his hands, King Charles faced a dilemma that carried both deeply personal and constitutional dimensions. The personal aspect was painfully obvious. This was his mother's dying wish concerning his son, the child he had loved and worried about throughout his life, but also the son who had angered and disappointed him in recent years. The constitutional dimension, however, was equally significant and perhaps even more complicated. As king, every decision Charles made carried implications that extended far beyond family dynamics. Whatever choice he made regarding this information would send clear signals about his reign, his priorities, and his overall vision for the monarchy's future. His relationship with Harry had deteriorated significantly since the move to California. The public accusations made during interviews, the Netflix documentary series that aired private family matters, and Harry's memoir with its harsh criticisms of Charles as both a father and as a future king had all wounded him deeply. Charles had spent his entire life preparing to become monarch, and part of that extensive preparation involved developing thick skin when it came to criticism. But criticism from your own son, broadcast to millions of people around the world, cuts through even the thickest protective layer. The anger Charles felt was genuine and real, yet it coexisted uncomfortably with the love he still held for Harry, creating a constant internal tension that never quite went away. William's reaction to this discovery would also matter significantly. The Prince of Wales had been even more unforgiving than his father when it came to Harry's departure and the subsequent public comments. The relationship between the two brothers, once remarkably close during their younger years, had fractured in ways that seemed beyond repair. William viewed Harry's actions as betrayals not just of the family on a personal level, but of the institution of monarchy itself. He had consistently advised his father to take a firm line, to make absolutely clear that there were real consequences for the choices Harry had made. The discovery of the Queen's hidden provision would inevitably complicate William's position and potentially create friction between Charles and his heir. Charles arranged a private meeting with William for the following day. He knew the conversation would be difficult, but it was necessary. He needed to inform his eldest son about the clause before any decisions were made about how to proceed. William had a right to know what their grandmother had done. More pragmatically, Charles needed William's support, or at least his understanding of the situation. If the King and the Prince of Wales were publicly at odds over how to handle Harry, it would create exactly the kind of family drama that weakened the monarchy and provided endless material for the press to dissect for months on end. The meeting took place in Charles's private sitting room, away from staff and potential interruptions. William arrived alone, having sensed from his father's tone during the invitation that this was something serious. When Charles began explaining what had been discovered in the estate documents, William's face visibly darkened. He listened without interrupting as the details emerged, his jaw tightening noticeably as Charles described the conditions and requirements their grandmother had included. When Charles finally finished his explanation, William's response came immediately and with sharp clarity. Their grandmother had overstepped her bounds. She had no right to bind the family to conditions that would essentially require reconciliation with someone who had repeatedly attacked them in public. The money itself was one thing, but requiring Harry to spend substantial time in the United Kingdom and giving both Harry and Charles oversight of how Harry's children were raised felt like manipulation from beyond the grave. Charles allowed his son to express his anger fully. He understood where it came from because he shared some of those same feelings, but he also knew his mother well enough to understand her motivations on a deeper level, and he felt the heavy weight of obligation that came with being both her son and her successor. She had asked him, as directly as a queen and mother possibly could, to give Harry another chance, to use her final gift as an opportunity for healing rather than further division. Could he simply refuse that request? More importantly, should he refuse it? the question proved far less simple than William seemed to think it was. The conversation between father and son lasted well over an hour, voices sometimes rising with emotion before settling back into tense discussion. No consensus emerged from the meeting. William made his position absolutely clear. If Charles chose to honor this provision in full, to reach out to Harry and offer him this inheritance with all its attached conditions, then William would not actively stand in the way. But neither would he participate in any reconciliation efforts. He would not pretend that Harry's return to spending significant time in the United Kingdom was something he welcomed or supported. He would be civil if circumstances required it, but he would not go beyond basic courtesy. The wounds Harry had inflicted were too deep, the trust too thoroughly broken. Charles could play the role of forgiving father if he wished. William would remain the protective older brother who had not forgotten the pain Harry had caused to Catherine and their children. Beyond the immediate family dynamics, Charles also had to consider the broader implications for the institution of monarchy itself. Public opinion regarding Harry remained sharply divided. Some people saw him as a victim of an outdated and rigid institution, a man who had bravely chosen love and mental health over duty and tradition. Others viewed him as spoiled and ungrateful, someone willing to exploit his royal connections for commercial gain while simultaneously attacking the very family that had given him every advantage in life. How the general public would react to news of a substantial inheritance with conditions seemingly designed to lure Harry back into the fold was genuinely unpredictable. It could be interpreted as compassionate and family-oriented, showing that the royals valued personal relationships over institutional pride. Or it could be seen as weakness, as the monarchy allowing itself to be held hostage by someone who had already taken so much and given very little in return. Charles's team of advisors found themselves split on how to proceed. The older generation, those who had served his mother for decades, tended to counsel honoring her wishes fully and immediately. They spoke about duty, about respecting the wishes of the deceased, about the fundamental importance of family unity. The younger advisors, those who thought more in contemporary terms of public relations and modern monarchy, were considerably more cautious. They worried about setting problematic precedents, about appearing to reward what many viewed as bad behavior, about the optics of Charles seeming to be controlled by his mother's wishes even after her death. During the quiet hours late that night, Charles sat alone in his study long after his advisors had departed. He thought about his mother, about the countless times over the decades she had guided him, advised him, and sometimes directly overruled his decisions. She had been the one constant presence throughout his entire life, the North Star by which he had navigated through decades of preparation for the role he now held. She had not been perfect, and she had certainly made mistakes along the way. But her love for her family had never been in question, and her dedication to the institution of monarchy had been absolutely unwavering until her final breath. This clause represented her final piece of guidance, her last bit of advice delivered from beyond death itself. Could he simply ignore it? More importantly, should he ignore it? The dilemma Charles wrestled with was ultimately about defining what kind of king he wanted to be and what kind of father he wanted to be remembered as, and whether those two identities could somehow coexist in this impossible moment. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Montecito, California, Prince Harry had absolutely no idea that his grandmother's will contained a provision specifically designed for him, or that his father had just discovered it and was currently wrestling with what to do next. Harry's life in California had settled into a rhythm that was both dramatically different from his previous royal existence and, in some unexpected ways, surprisingly similar in its demands and pressures. The Netflix projects, the memoir tours, the speaking engagements at corporate events and conferences all required a level of public performance that was not entirely different from royal duties, just with different masters to serve and different protocols to follow. Financially, Harry and Meghan were secure but not nearly as wealthy as many people assumed. The Netflix and Spotify deals had provided substantial sums initially, but maintaining their lifestyle, covering extensive security costs and funding their various charitable initiatives required ongoing income streams. Harry had been born into considerable wealth, but he had not inherited the kind of generational fortune that would allow him to simply live comfortably off investments forever. He needed to continue working to generate revenue, which meant navigating the complex and sometimes awkward relationship between his royal past and his commercial present. The relationship with his father remained strained and distant. They had spoken occasionally over the past few years, brief conversations usually centered on unavoidable logistics around the children or major family events that required some coordination. Harry had attended Charles's coronation, but the visit had been remarkably brief and the interactions minimal and formal. He had reached out to offer condolences and support during his father's cancer diagnosis earlier in 2024, but the response had been polite rather than warm. The wall between them seemed high and solid, and it appeared to grow even higher with each passing month of silence and increasing distance. Charles's team of advisors eventually recommended what they called a hybrid approach to handling the delicate situation. A formal legal notification would be sent through the proper official channels, informing Harry of the inheritance, its specific conditions, and the detailed process for claiming it. This would satisfy all legal requirements and create a clear paper trail. Simultaneously, Charles would compose a personal letter, kept brief and carefully measured in tone, acknowledging the discovery of his mother's provision and expressing his intention to honor her wishes. The letter would not plead or make demands, but it would open a door and create space for conversation if Harry chose to. Walk through it. The timeline for Harry's response would prove critically important to how events unfolded. The legal documents would need to specify a reasonable period, likely 90 days, during which Harry could formally accept or reject the terms of the inheritance. Acceptance would trigger a complex series of legal and practical steps that would need to be carefully coordinated. Trustees would need to be appointed and approved by both parties. Detailed frameworks for monitoring compliance with the various conditions would need to be established and agreed upon. Mechanisms for managing and distributing the children's funds would need to be set up with input from multiple parties. All of this would require sustained communication between Harry's legal representatives and palace officials, creating ongoing interactions that have been essentially non-existent in recent years. Outright rejection would be simpler in some ways, though more complicated in others. If Harry formally rejected the inheritance in its entirety, the funds would revert back to the general estate and be distributed according to the will's other provisions. The money would likely be absorbed into various charitable trusts and foundations. But the public relations implications of such a rejection would be significant and difficult to manage. Harry would inevitably be portrayed in one of two ways by different segments of the media and public. Some would see him as principled and independent, unwilling to accept conditions that compromised his autonomy. Others would view him as ungrateful and petty, turning down his grandmother's dying gift simply because it came with strings attached. The resulting narrative battle would be fought across newspapers, television programs, and social media platforms for months, with neither side likely to gain a clear advantage. The most realistic scenario, however, might involve neither immediate acceptance nor outright rejection, but rather a prolonged period of negotiation. Harry's lawyers would almost certainly seek modifications to the conditions, arguing that certain requirements were too restrictive, impractical, given his current life circumstances, or unclear in their implementation. Perhaps the 90 days per year requirement could be reduced to 60 days, they might argue. Or perhaps the requirement could be structured to be spread across multiple years, rather than being an annual obligation. Maybe the trustee arrangement for the children's funds could be modified to give Harry and Meghan more direct control, while still maintaining some palace oversight. The Queen had been remarkably thorough in her drafting, working with experienced legal counsel to create tight language. But even the most carefully constructed legal documents leave some room for interpretation and discussion, especially when both parties have strong motivations to find workable solutions. For King Charles, these potential negotiations would represent a genuine test of character and judgment. How much would he be willing to bend to accommodate Harry's legitimate concerns about the conditions? How much would he insist on adhering strictly to the letter of his mother's wishes? Finding the right balance would require a type of wisdom that went well beyond legal expertise or political calculation. It would require truly understanding his son, understanding what might genuinely bring him back into some form of family connection, versus what might push him even further away. Charles had accumulated decades of experience in negotiation and diplomacy through his various roles before becoming king. But those hard-earned skills had never been tested in circumstances this intensely personal and this emotionally painful. The potential impact on other members of the royal family, particularly William's children, added yet another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. George, Charlotte, and Louis were Harry's niece and nephews, family, connections that should have been naturally nurtured as the children grew up together, but had instead withered in the toxic climate created by adult conflicts. If Harry began spending significant amounts of time in the United Kingdom again, as the inheritance conditions required, would there be genuine opportunities for these cousins to develop real relationships with each other? Would William permit such interactions, or would he continue to maintain careful distance between his children and their uncle? The Queen's vision, as expressed in her carefully written provision, seemed to include the goal of mending these generational rifts before they became permanent. But actual implementation would depend on cooperation from multiple family members, not all of whom shared her instinct toward reconciliation. The best possible outcome would involve Harry accepting the inheritance and genuinely embracing not just the letter, but the spirit of the conditions his grandmother had established. He would spend meaningful time in the United Kingdom and Commonwealth countries, not merely checking boxes to satisfy legal requirements, but actually engaging with charitable work and community initiatives. His children would develop real connections to their British heritage, building relationships with their cousins and their grandfather. The money would provide security without creating dependency, and the conditions would create structure without feeling like imprisonment. Over time, perhaps years, the family relationships could heal enough that the formal requirements would become unnecessary because natural family bonds had been restored. This was almost certainly what Queen Elizabeth had envisioned when she spent her final months crafting this provision, a framework that would force initial contact but could eventually lead to genuine reconciliation. But the more realistic scenario, acknowledged by most observers, would likely involve something messier and more partial than complete: healing. Harry might accept the money but resist fully embracing the spirit behind the conditions. He might meet the technical requirements while maintaining considerable emotional distance from the family. He would spend his obligatory time in the United Kingdom or Commonwealth nations, fulfilling the letter of the agreement, but potentially avoiding deeper family engagement beyond what was absolutely necessary. The relationships might become cordial rather than warm, functional rather than close. This would represent a kind of reconciliation, certainly better than complete estrangement, but not the healing transformation the Queen had hoped for when she drafted her hidden clause with such care and thought. The worst-case scenario, one that palace officials privately worried about, would involve the inheritance becoming yet another flashpoint for public conflict. Harry might accept the money and the conditions, but then publicly complain about them through interviews or other media appearances. He could portray the requirements as evidence of ongoing family control and manipulation. Another example of the institution trying to dictate his life even after he had worked so hard to establish independence. The media would feast enthusiastically on such a narrative, and the resulting coverage would damage both Harry personally and the monarchy as an institution. Charles would find himself portrayed as either weak for attempting to buy back his son's loyalty, or cruel for attaching burdensome conditions to what should have been unconditional familial support. The Queen's final attempt at family peacemaking would be twisted into its opposite, becoming another weapon in the ongoing public war between Harry and the institution he had left behind. The path forward remained unclear, genuinely uncertain, and fraught with emotional landmines and practical obstacles at every turn. But it was a path which represented more than the family had possessed before this discovery. Queen Elizabeth, even in death, had managed to give them something concrete to work with. A carefully constructed framework within which reconciliation might become possible if everyone involved proved willing to make the effort and the compromises necessary. Whether they would ultimately prove willing remained the great unanswered question hanging over everything. But for the first time in years of estrangement and public conflict, there existed at least a map, drawn by a grandmother's experienced hand, that showed a potential way back from complete separation towards something that might eventually, possibly, with enough effort and goodwill, resemble a functional family again. The hidden clause in Queen Elizabeth's will had finally emerged from secrecy into the harsh and unforgiving light of reality. King Charles now held in his hands both a significant burden and a genuine opportunity, a final test from his mother, and simultaneously a final gift. What he and Harry ultimately chose to do with this unexpected provision would shape not just their personal relationship, but potentially the future trajectory of the monarchy itself. The clock was ticking steadily forward. Difficult decisions would need to be made sooner rather than later. and across the vast distance that separated London from California, across thousands of miles and years of accumulated hurt. A family's fate hung delicately in the balance, suspended precariously between the undeniable pain of the past and the uncertain possibilities of whatever might come next.